You're listening to episode 60 of the Fed and Fearless podcast. On today's episode, you'll hear from John O'Connor about how you can use your genes to find the best diet for your unique body. So stay tuned. Hi, I'm Laura Schoenfeld. I'm a registered dietitian and coach trained in functional medicine with a passion for helping women just like you ditch perfectionism and use food, fitness, and self-care to fuel your bigger God-given purpose. I believe that it's possible to achieve your biggest life-changing goals without the frustration, obsession, or negative self-talk that so many women subject themselves to every day. All you need are the right tools, the right mindset, and the faith to turn your dreams into reality. I'm here to guide you along the way. The truth is that you are so much more than a body, and I'm on a mission to help you change the way you think and act at a core beliefs level so you can transform your physical, mental, and spiritual health from the inside out. Are you ready to become fed and fearless in your pursuit of a healthy, meaningful life? Welcome to the Fed and Fearless podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Fed and Fearless podcast. I'm Laura Schoenfeld. I'm your host as always. And today we have an episode or an interview, I should say, that really takes me back to just the years that I spent so involved in the ancestral and paleo community. It feels like a million years ago, especially this year feels like a brand new century, let alone a new year. But many of you are familiar with me and my work because of the work I was doing starting really in 2012 in the ancestral health community. Some of you know me from my connection with Chris Kresser, who's quite well known in the paleo and ancestral health world. And I really got my start in the field of nutrition with my involvement in that community. Even before I graduated my graduate program at UNC, I was talking about paleo, talking about ancestral health, super into it. And a lot has changed since then. It's not that I'm anti-ancestral health. I certainly still believe in a lot of the principles, but I just am not, first of all, not as involved in that community anymore, simply because I've just moved on to different communities. I feel like the communities I tend to spend the most time in are the entrepreneurial space, just because it's a lot more fun for me to think about solving problems that help people make more money and make a bigger impact on the world. So that's where my time has been being spent in the last couple of years. But when I first started my business back in 2014, I was very much involved in the ancestral health community and really build myself as an ancestral health dietitian. So like I said, even though I still believe in a lot of those principles, I just haven't been super involved in those communities over the past couple of years for a variety of reasons. And, I'm not too upset about that. I think sometimes getting out of the spaces that are only talking about health and only talking about nutrition and fitness can be really good for you from a mental health perspective. But I have nothing bad to say about those communities. I just feel like for me, moving on past them was something that I was ready to do in the last couple of years. And I'm just enjoying myself more talking with people about their businesses and about helping them really get their message out into the world so that they can make an impact on the health and the lives of their clients. So all of that said, I feel like today's interview really took me back to the stuff that I was so focused on in 2011, 2012, really up until maybe 2016, 2017 was when I started to shift a little bit. And then this past year or so was really where I started to go all in on the entrepreneurial piece. But that said, I am still interested in things like genetic information and nutrigenomics and how we can use technology to help us live healthier lives and to support our unique bodies the way that we were created. So all of that said, it was really interesting to kind of go back to my roots and start talking more about things like gene influences on your nutrition and how we can use technology and functional medicine to pick the diet and lifestyle that's going to work best for us. all of that said, I decided to bring on this guest today because, like I said, I think it's very interesting and very informative, and I wanted to give you guys all the opportunity to hear about it. So today's guest is John O'Connor. John is the founder of Gene Food and the host of the Gene Food podcast. Like many who make their way into the wellness world, John was inspired to create a platform that could empower people to find personalized health solutions after he realized his health and dietary needs didn't fit the template offered by conventional nutrition and medicine. After his career in the New York City startup world left him stressed, burned out, physically sick, and unsatisfied with what he saw as the cookie cutter approach of traditional medicine, John became a, quote, citizen scientist and turned to the deep medical research as well as alternative forms of medicine to restore his health. A passionate bio-individualist who believes that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to nutrition, his current journey is one of self-discovery aimed at gaining as much insight as possible as to how his unique physiology works. John's role at Gene Food is to help condense and distill the latest studies and commentary on nutrition science and nutrigenomics and communicate the core message to the Gene Food audience. So John and I actually have a lot in common with his background and my background and how we got into this world. He very much agrees with me in the sense that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to nutrition, that we all have our own unique needs, and that it's important for us to be looking for what works best for us rather than just following a cookie cutter approach. So we're definitely on the same page about that. And I just love how John does such a great job at taking stuff that can be pretty complicated, complicated science, stuff that most of us lay people or even us professionals don't necessarily totally understand or know how to make decisions using that information about our own personal behavior. And so it's really cool to me to see how his company Gene Food is making that information more accessible to the general public. So I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation that I had with John. He's got a lot of wisdom and expertise and insight into the field of nutrigenomics, and he has a really cool product that he has helped develop to help make that information accessible to all of us. So without further ado, here is John O'Connor. All right, everybody. Well, I am super excited to have with me on the show today, John O'Connor. Welcome to the Fed and Fearless podcast, John.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, Laura.
Yeah, well, I was very interested when your team reached out to me to discuss having this interview based on the particular business that you run and the way that you guys do the analysis of dietary recommendations. I loved that you referred to it as the Myers-Briggs of nutrition because I am like a big personality junkie. So I was really interested to get to sit down to talk to you about this today. But first, so my audience can get to know you better and get to understand how you're even in this world in the first place, I would love to hear your story about how you became so passionate about helping people find the best diet for their unique bodies.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of people that get involved in this space, the health and wellness space, are people who have gotten on the wrong side of their own health issues in the past and have had to work really hard to figure out a system that works for them. And I'm definitely one of those people. You know, I was living in New York City. I mean, I was living in New York City actually very recently. My girlfriend and I left in February on a trip and never came back just because of COVID, and everybody that was there was kind of like, you know, it's probably not a great time to come back. So we've been out in different parts of the world and in Wyoming right now. And having lived in New York for a long time, you know, working in startups, having a lot of work stress and having an unhealthy lifestyle really put me in a position where I was on the wrong side of my mental health. I was feeling very scattered. I was feeling very lacking the attention span that I wanted, not always showing up in terms of mood and personality the way I know I can for my loved ones and for people that are close to me. And the way that it manifested, sort of the way, at least the way that I identify mechanistically that it kind of came to fruition for me in terms of not feeling great, was these histamine pathways and kind of like an overactive immune system. So I would, be going out a lot in New York, working long hours, drinking a lot of wine, just not really taking great care of myself. And I started to see these hallmarks of histamine intolerance that would show up in my life. So for me, that looks like I'd be at a friend's wedding. I'd get a bug bite. The bug bite would swell up to the size of a golf ball. And it was just this really bizarre situation that I'm going on antibiotics and going and seeing physicians who for these types of situations are not really in their wheelhouse, and kind of lost in the shuffle of our medical system, which I actually always want to say I have tremendous respect for, and I think is incredible in so many things. But with some of these underlying smoldering chronic issues, there's a lot of people that get left behind with these types of issues. And so I'm on this pattern. I'm getting these bug bites that are swelling up, having, periods of anxiety, just feeling off overall. And I discovered through a lot of self-experimentation and reading and research that, that there was these issues that were unique for me. I noticed that location was had a huge impact on my overall state of wellness. And I worked with a doctor in San Diego who became a good friend of mine, who introduced me to this whole world of lab testing that I had never really been aware of, that I'm still fascinated by, and that still I nerd out on. And I realized that there's a huge spectrum for people, and there's all these different phenotypes, and there's all these different reasons why people can fall out of balance. And many of them are uncategorized, and people are left in the dark as to why they've started to struggle. And so it created Gene Food, not because we think that genetics is the answer to every single one of these problems. Frankly, it's not. But it's a really good foundational tool. And I think that what we need out there in our conversations in nutrition and in the conversations that take place in medicine is a movement towards systems that can identify differentiation points between people that can put them on paths that are custom, rather than the politicized conversations that we tend to have, where we literally mimic our political parties and just tell everybody, you have to be keto, you have to be carnivore, you have to be vegan, you have to be vegetarian. I don't believe in that. And so I wanted to create something that could start to empower people with exploring their own individuality.
Mm-hmm. That's so funny that you link it to the political parties, because I'm like, you know what? That's actually, I feel like kind of true. And it's interesting that it ends up that way. And I agree with you. I feel like the customization piece, unless you're working with someone who is spending the time to really dive in and really like dig into all the different factors that could be coming into play with your health, it's like you don't really get that from a conventional medical provider. And like you said, it's very often not their fault. They don't have a lot of time to spend with you. It's, insurance doesn't cover certain things. So they kind of have their hands tied when it comes to actually going to the level of depth that is necessary. But I do really love the possibility of technology being used to make it easier and make it not take, an hour to try to figure something out for somebody. If you could just run something through a program that helps at least give a starting point. So that's really, I feel like really important that we use technology for the good of us and not necessarily just try to fight against technology to, go back to like, paleo type of eating or something like that. So, as I was perusing your blog before jumping on this interview today, I saw that you had a post about your disagreement with Scientific American. They had an article that said matching DNA to a diet does not work. And from what I read, I'm not going to, I guess I will give away the answer, but you don't agree with that. So can you tell the listeners why you disagree with Scientific American on that point?
Yeah, of course. So there's 30,000 genes in the human genome, approximately. And the Scientific American article looks at a study that was done by Stanford researchers. The head researcher was a guy named Chris Gardner. And he had a study that had come out a period of years before where they'd taken people based on 30,000 genes in the human genome. They're looking at 3 total. And the only outcome that they looked for was weight loss. So they have a study that looks at 3 genes and it studies weight loss, which is great. Look, I mean, it's cool. The first study that Dr. Gardner did found a benefit. So they found that the people that were put on a DNA assigned diet lost 33% more weight than people that were not. And so they followed up with a bigger study and they couldn't replicate the results. And the failure to replicate the success of the first study is reported in our clickbait society as DNA diets don't work. And the reason why it's reported that way is not because of the substance of whether DNA diets do or do not work, or talking about genetic risk scoring versus looking at 1 or 2 SNPs. It's done to drive clicks. We're so wired towards the extremes right now that people just need to see something like that in order to even pay attention. And so I think that headline is much more of a reflection of our collective lack of attention span much more so than anything having to do with DNA diets, because at the end of the day, a DNA diet is really, it's not looking at one or two SNPs. You have a study that's come out since that Scientific American article was published, which again looked at a narrow issue. It looked at the postprandial period for triglycerides, blood glucose, and it was done by a scientist named Tim Spector at King's College London, and there's a bunch of Harvard scientists that were on it. It used AI. They used the identical twin database in the UK to literally look at people that are genetically identical, and then trying to tease out just how much of their postprandial, the period after they eat, immediately after they eat, is determined by genetics. And what they found is, look, 50% of the postprandial blood sugar response is driven by genetics, less so triglycerides, right? And so as the science progresses, the postprandial period for people is a huge thing. For people that have issues with blood sugar regulation, there's a lot of inflammation that can come from a constant yo-yoing of your blood sugar. So if you have 50% of that process that's driven by your genetics, it's probably something you're going to want to know about, right? And so I think, and that's not even getting into just feel free to cut me off at any time. Like I said before, I can certainly pontificate on all these issues, but that doesn't even get into really as much into cardiometabolic in terms of the lipid response. What is your, what does your lipid profile look like? Your fasted lipid profile look like on different dietary protocols based on different dietary interventions. There's a lot of science out there about hyperabsorbers, hypersynthetic reactions to saturated fat, people that go on certain diets that are very poorly suited to their metabolism and genetic predispositions, having very bad outcomes. And what the DNA diet, quote unquote, will do in the future, what we're doing right now as a product, is you're taking all these different markers that we know about, and then you're creating a genetic risk score. And the Scientific American article, it's so far from that. You can't take that away from that level of science.
Well, and it would seem like even just the fact that they're only looking at weight loss as the result. I mean, I feel like that's even silly to me, that that's not something that they would have been aware of. And I didn't read the article, so maybe they do mention that as part of the, giving themselves a little objectivity or something like that. But I mean, just because somebody doesn't lose weight doesn't mean that there wasn't a benefit, right? So it's like, I feel like our society wants to look at very specific markers to say, well, this diet works or this diet doesn't work. And the word work is so arbitrary. It's like, it doesn't really capture the full spectrum of the influence of food and nutrition, that I feel like to have a study where you're just looking at one change and a couple different genes, the idea that could then reflect on the entire validity of nutrigenomics just seems really bizarre to me. I get it. Like you said, clickbait and all that, people need that kind of stuff to pay attention these days, but you would think that they would have a little bit more nuance in the review of the studies that exist.
Well, totally. And that's part of the whole point, is that there's a lot of stuff that's done in different spheres of medicine and different spheres of nutrition that do look at nutrigenomics, but to tie it together into a DNA diet is still a thing that's relatively new. So, you touched on it a minute ago with the whole issue of, we're not blaming allopathic medicine. I'm continually fascinated and impressed by allopathic medicine, especially in cardiovascular settings, but it's not just that they don't have the time. It's also that we're not at the tip of the spear. We always think of ourselves as being at the tip of the spear. We're the most modern iteration of humanity. So therefore we have all of this wisdom. We can look back with 20/20 hindsight on our near ancestors and people in history and think of them and seeing all the different ways that they've erred. But people will be soon looking at us in that way too. And so there has to be a humility to say, look, we don't want quackery. We don't want to be misleading the public. But we also want to make room and hold space for innovation. And some of these genetic markers are going to be it's just going to be run of the mill. You're just going to know whether you're hyperabsorbing cholesterol. You're going to know what your predispositions are for saturated fat. You're going to know if you carry some of these histamine genes. We already do know that there's a huge role for nutrigenomics and lactose intolerance and celiac. And so there's a tremendous amount we can already do with what we have. And the last thing we want to do is get dogmatic about it or tell somebody that they have to fit the template that we assign to them. It's not the purpose of what we're doing. The purpose of what we're doing is to clue them in on what makes them different and why they might want to move in a slightly different path than some of the nutrition influencers who are really beating the drum in their ear that they should be on X, Y, or Z diet.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I feel like a lot of those, one-sided influencers that focus on one particular method, I would not be surprised if they had genetics that made that method work better for them. And I feel like a lot of times people use their own personal experience to suggest what other people should be doing. And I think that just can get very dangerous, no matter, like you said, if you're like keto carnivore or if you're a raw vegan. I feel like most people don't do great with those ends of the extremes. There might be a few that do. And if they do, then, good for them. But they shouldn't necessarily be saying that that's what the entire planet should be eating for good health. So let's talk a little bit about your Gene Food program, because like I said, and I can't remember if I said this on the recording or not, but I was able to run my genetics through the program and to be able to see the results that I got. And so it was really interesting to look at the way that report is set up. How does the program Gene Food work to guide people's food decisions?
We want to take a science-based approach. So what we have is we have over 120 genetic markers that we look at, and we're scoring them based on the strength of the research. So our head of research and lead geneticist, Dr. Aaron Gardner, who's on my team, he created the algorithm based on, it's genetic risk scoring essentially. And what we're most interested in is cardiometabolic health, because that's where the meat of the science is, right? So the first thing we want to do is we want to try to identify different phenotypes of heart disease and give people a clue as to which direction they might want to look. So for example, your diet type came back forager. Forager is a diet that's meant to be lower glycemic, because we would predict algorithmically that you could be somebody if you were eating a diet that was too high in especially refined carbohydrates. You could see corresponding elevated levels of triglycerides. You could see some of the insulin resistant markers of heart disease like small dense LDL and VLDL elevated, and that you could have a little more of a yo-yo issue with your period immediately after you eat. And so somebody in your who scores as you do, you're scoring into a lower glycemic, slightly lower carbohydrate diet group for that reason, because of what we could see as maybe a predisposition towards insulin resistance if you get out of balance. But also somebody who at the same time can't go and blow out the saturated fat pathways, because you would see an elevated LDL cholesterol and some of these other heart health markers. So we're trying to basically tell people, look, you can get out of balance to the carbohydrate side of the fence, and you can get out of balance to the fat side of the fence. So here's how we'd adjust your micros so that you're kind of like in the meat of your curve. So you're not taking your cholesterol numbers and blowing them out. And you're also being mindful of some of these metabolic predispositions that we would score you as potentially having. So that's like the starting point, is kind of the cardiometabolic side of it.
And it's interesting because I feel like, and maybe this is just me having the lens of a premenopausal woman, but it's interesting to me that so much of the research is focused on the cardiometabolic piece, and not that things like insulin resistance aren't related to the concerns that someone like me might have, but it is curious because I feel like sometimes the stuff that might not be great for cardiometabolic health is better for like fertility or women's hormones, that kind of thing. So do you find that most of the information that's available at this point is more about like chronic disease state, or is there anything that focuses on, supporting like optimal health and not just disease?
Well, it's funny you say that, because for us, like your cardiovascular health is probably the most important thing you can control with nutrition. And it's one of the most important things you can do to be in an optimal state of health. Your endothelial function, your blood pressure, right? And heart disease is still the number one killer of people in this country. And the best science tells us that it's not your LDL cholesterol, it's your total particle count. It's your apolipoprotein B count. And because that's a disease that develops over 40 or 50 years, I feel like you're going to be living a much better version of yourself if you are able to dial in those two markers, the blood sugar markers and the heart health markers. We stick to them because that's where the best science is, but that's going to affect everything else downstream. So, we don't have great science on tying nutrigenomics to, hormonal issues for women at this point, right? So we have to kind of stay in our lane and go where we have a science-based approach, and also have humility and say the genetics is the foundational tool. The genetics is what you're building on. There's a lot of other pieces to that puzzle as well. Sleep affects hormones, stress affects hormones. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the heart health and metabolic issues we see as being like a big enough issue to tackle that we're happy to take those on, because I think that's where a lot of people get out of balance.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and like I said, I certainly don't want to downplay the importance of cardiovascular health. And when I was looking at mine, and we can definitely go into more detail about what does the report actually look at and what are some of the things that it's discussing, since obviously it can't look at every single component of lifestyle, but it's looking at a lot of the dietary things that people tend to concern themselves with. But a lot of my personal experience and just knowledge from like an educational perspective, I was reading my report through that lens of saying, okay, well, that makes sense. I've had that experience before. Or, oh, that's kind of weird that they recommend that, because when I eat that way, I don't have the best like physical reaction. So first, why don't we just, because I want people to know what we're talking about. I have my report in front of me, and I think you said you do too. So I do want people to understand like the basics of what the report says, so that when we're talking about specifics, it makes sense. So can you just do like a quick overview of what the report actually tells people about their dietary? I don't want to say like, it's not a specific recommendation, like, 100%, this is what you should follow, but it's gene-based information that would maybe influence some of the decisions that you're making about your diet.
Sure. Yeah. So, we have, as you said at the beginning, we have this kind of Myers-Briggs approach where we have 20 diet types, and you're assigned into one of these different diet types. And for example, your diet type forager, so lower carbohydrate, especially lower glycemic carbohydrate, because as we all know, sometimes carbohydrate and protein can overlap, especially if you're eating more of a plant-based diet. We're trying to give you an idea about how to stay in range with the most important lipid markers from your fat approach. That's what we're really interested in. It sounds like you're not as interested in that. That's what we're super interested in. That's what we're really passionate about, is lipidology and trying to put people on a diet that's heart healthy. And then that's going to affect the carbohydrate side and the fat side. But we get into other things like wheat score. So you can see with a pretty high likelihood that somebody has celiac from their genetic panels. So we can basically test for gluten sensitivity, or somebody that probably should get tested for celiac. Again, we look at LDL predisposition. And I don't know, like some of your audience, just to give some important context for some of this focus on heart health, I think one of the things in the nutrition community that's been very unfortunate is we have a large vocal chorus of kind of like what I would call like cholesterol deniers, who will say that, based on certain statin trials or certain drug trials, that you don't need to worry about your LDL cholesterol and you don't need to worry about dietary cholesterol. And I think that in some cases that's true. I think there are people that are really, as you said earlier, really well suited towards a diet that's, higher in saturated fat and cholesterol and can do just fine. And we have a bunch of those people in our algorithm. You'd probably fall in the middle on that. But then there are people that our view is that that's not the best side of the science. And so we want to try to preach the gospel of, keeping an eye on these markers as a foundational tool going forward for your whole life. And that's something we really believe deeply. And we have a lot of people on our podcast that are very, that are in the lipid community. And so that's something we're very into. But we also get into methylation, something that people are interested in that's a little more bordering on probably the alternative side of the fence in terms of your B vitamin metabolism, and labs you can look at like homocysteine, for example, is one of the telltale signs that you might be methylating poorly. We touch on sterile absorption, and which is basically cholesterol absorption, which is kind of like an egg section of the report. We do get into micronutrients. We have a portion of the report that talks about sodium. We have detox. So some of your listeners may be aware of heard of glutathione, which is one of the master antioxidants that the body makes endogenously. And there are certain genetic variants that are associated with lower production of not only glutathione, but also another antioxidant that's native to the body, which is called superoxide dismutase, which will neutralize free radicals and kind of clean up some of the metabolic waste in the body, heavy metals, things like that. Some people with certain superoxide dismutase genetic mutations don't do as good of a job of kind of binding to and getting rid of all this toxic stuff in the environment. And so we would recommend, different types of cooking equipment and things of that nature. For men, there's really interesting studies that these detox markers can be nutrigenomic, in that there are studies that look at the effects of, for example, like the antioxidants in pomegranate juice on men's risk for prostate cancer, and not only on men's risk for prostate cancer, but on combating prostate cancer once it sets in. Prostate cancer is a huge issue for men. If you want to be a healthy man, you need to be able to take care of your prostate.
And actually, do you mind if I just as a quick little anecdote in there, it's really interesting. My dad actually was diagnosed with prostate cancer in the last couple of years. It was very low grade, and my mom's a integrative and functional dietitian as well. And she basically completely overhauled his diet, pretty much almost 100% pulled out red meat, which I know, a lot of men in the paleo world are very much like red meat every day, all the time. But she more or less took it out other than special occasions and put a variety of different supplements in. And the most recent couple of screens he's had, he came back with no cancer found, essentially, when they did the biopsies. So I will say from I'm not going to say that my mom cured his cancer or something, but it is pretty wild that a lot of the recommendations that come out of the paleo space, when we did the research on, how my dad should be eating to recover from prostate cancer, it was very different from what, some of the more vocal paleo recommendations would be. So I just wanted to throw that in there as not that my personal experience or my dad's experience means that everybody should be doing it this way, but I do think it's interesting that you mentioned that, because for sure, I think there's some recommendations out there that maybe not for everybody, but for a lot of people probably could really increase cancer risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a whole nother, God, I could get into the whole Valter Longo, inflammatory nature of amino acids conversation, but that's probably I don't know if we have the time for that detour, but yeah, no, that's great to hear that your dad was able to recover and feel better. That's awesome. It's really cool. And this SOD too, these detox genes, the people that might have a lower native ability to produce endogenous antioxidants can maybe benefit from having more and different types of polyphenols and antioxidants introduced into their diet. And we do have evidence that can directly affect the health of the prostate. So that's really cool. We get into sleep chronotype. So there's pretty good data out there on the fact that maybe there's not a uniform bedtime. Some people are better off genetically going to bed a little bit later, getting up later, working at different hours. Some people are, want to be up and at them right first thing in the morning, and others are more in the middle. So we do touch on sleep chronotype, caffeine metabolism. Caffeine metabolism is really interesting. You have cytochrome P450 and all these different liver enzymes that basically break down and determine the half-life of caffeine is not the same in each individual. So some people have a lot of this stuff is enzymatic. The way I think of this very simply as a layperson is, we're gifted with these different proteins and these different enzymes, and not everybody has the same enzyme power behind some of these metabolic processes as other people. And so, somebody that doesn't break down caffeine as quickly, you might have a half-life of caffeine that's 12 hours. Well, that means that the quarter life is 24 hours. So that means that when you're drinking caffeine, you're never really fully metabolizing it out of your system. And so, caffeine blocks the adenosine receptors. It directly disrupts sleep. And large amounts of caffeine, or maybe even caffeine at all, are probably not a good look for some people, especially if we're talking about functional approach to stress and hormones. I mean, sleep is at the foundation of all this. So having just baseline, it sounds basic to somebody probably like you or I, who are kind of in the weeds on this stuff, but just knowing your caffeine metabolism is super important.
Well, I'm laughing. It sounds basic, but when it comes to actually implementing
it's addictive.
The recommendations. Yeah. I mean, I was kind of laughing because I know I've known for a while I'm a slow metabolizer. I didn't need a gene report to tell me that just based on how I react to it. But it is interesting to think about, like, you know, if it's a 12-hour half-life, like if you're having a coffee less than 24 hours apart, you're just stockpiling caffeine basically in your system, which I can definitely admit to having some physical reaction to that over time, especially. So sadly, it's easier said than done. You can know all the information. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to apply it.
Totally. And you know, with caffeine, it's really interesting because a lot of people will come back and they'll show that they metabolize caffeine normally. And they'll be like, well, you said, you know, I know how I feel when I have caffeine. Another issue that we report on is histamine, right? So a lot of drinks that are high in, that have a lot of caffeine also have a lot of histamine, or they histamine liberate. So they'll release histamine in our immune cells. And, histamine is a huge issue. So a lot of our different scoring, every single one of our diet types, one of the dividing lines is histamine metabolism. God, antibiotic use, so rampant right now, degrades the enzyme called diamine oxidase that breaks down histamine. Using NSAIDs breaks down. Alcohol degrades the body's ability to metabolize histamine, and a lot of alcohol is also very high in histamine. And so when you get, and some people are born with these genetic predispositions, they have low levels of these enzyme activity to begin with. And if you can't properly metabolize histamine, more prone to seasonal allergies, might have more, and this is my opinion, might have more of a susceptibility to location problems in certain types of locations. Now, gearing back over to like the science of it also is that you can have the same reaction in the gut that you will with wheat when your histamine clearance is compromised. So one of the things that wheat does to the intracellular tight junctions of the gut lining is it breaks down that epithelial wall, basically contributing to leaky gut by upregulating the production of a protein called zonulin. And you can have the exact same reaction to having uncleared histamine sitting around in your system for too long. So I feel like with the stress that we're seeing, with the antibiotic use that we're seeing, with how much alcohol we consume, with how disrupted our microbiomes are by glyphosate, because again, the microbiome, a balanced microbiome is you want to have certain species of bacteria in the gut that are histamine producing, but also some that are not. If you have too many that are histamine producing, you know, that's a problem as well. So we look at histamine quite a bit, and that's something I'm really proud of, to be able to put that on people's radars. Cannabis, you know, there's pretty good research out there that some of us are genetically predisposed towards bad mental health outcomes when we're consuming a lot of THC. For myself, I think that cannabis has a definite place medicinally. For sure, I think it does. But when you get into these more is always better American attitudes on synthetic THC and really high dose edibles, especially people under 25 years of age, it's good to know whether you have some of these markers, like AKT1 is one of the genes that are associated with cannabis-induced psychosis, because this can take some people and push them over into a place mentally that is not good, and in some cases that they don't recover from. And so if you're out there listening and you have kids or you're younger, for many of us, that ship has long sailed, but it's probably better to keep the cannabis use to a minimum, or maybe not use it at all until you're 25, and then know your genetic predispositions. Mental health is so important. We look at sulfur tolerance. This is something that's a little bit more out there in terms of a more innovative, newer sphere of nutrition, but the way we metabolize some of these sulfur amino acids, either slowly or quickly, when they're metabolized quickly, can lead to excess ammonia. And so, look, I mean, there's a ton that's in the report, and there's always more that we're adding. We're adding a keto score, so you can see your PPARA alpha status, which will tell you essentially whether you're even capable of achieving a state of nutritional ketosis at all. You know, a lot of people go on a ketogenic diet, they can't get their millimolar count to a state where they're even in ketosis, and they never know it, and they're on like this catastrophic diet, and it's literally, you can see that in people's genetic charts. Hopefully that answers your question. That's kind of some of the highlights of what we have in the reports.
Well, yeah. I mean, I feel like I could ask you so many things, and I love the different names of the diets are so funny. Like the Paleo Plus is described as the Chris Kresser podcast. And then there's like, all these things, which is really funny. But what I was going to say, well, first of all, just a little bit of a detour. You mentioned a couple times now location issues. Can you just define that for me? Because I don't know if I'm understanding that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a Nietzsche quote going back, hundreds of years. He talked about as a young man, as an older man, lamenting having spent so much time in locations during his life that were totally unsuited to his physiology. And his theory was that at the time, this is Nietzsche, this is, German, a couple hundred years ago. And he's talking about how his theory is that a man or a woman can basically fail to bloom into who they're supposed to become, fail to bloom into their full power if they're in the wrong location. And so I've experienced that 100%. Like that's 100% true of me. I lived in Austin. It kind of moved to Austin after having lived in New York City as sort of like a nice middle ground. And I love Austin. It's a phenomenal town. I adore the people. I adore the town. It's a great place to live. The problem with Austin is it's really gnarly for allergies. And so, but let's get in just briefly to the science of that. So we know, there's been a lot of discussion of cytokine activity with COVID. So you have the cytokine storm. That's just your immune system just freaking out and releasing all of these military sentinels. The cytokines are the weaponry of the immune system, and they can kill invaders like viruses, but they can also start to attack and destroy your own tissue and your own lungs. And it's not a controversial point to say that your ambient environment, the air you breathe, has a big impact on your cytokine activity. I mean, if you have a pollen allergy, you're going to see increased cytokine activity when you're encountering a airborne allergen. If you're living next to a highway, there's really good studies that show, and this affects disproportionately people of color, underrepresented communities, people that are lower on the socioeconomic ladder, who are living in housing that's being built in places like California, smack next to highways. And what do you see in these people when you take their blood? You see elevated levels of C-reactive protein. You see disease. And so if you just take this on a spectrum and you look at it as like, okay, a spectrum, one side to the extreme side of the spectrum is you're breathing exhaust every day, which I think everybody could understand. But let's put it somewhere that's a little more murky in terms of what we think we know about things. Let's just say that you're in an environment where you're having a really bad reaction to allergens, or you're having a really bad reaction to ambient mold. That can affect your brain, that can affect your mood, that can affect the levels of inflammation in your body to a large degree. And there's a community of people, and I will caution listeners before you get on this rabbit hole, look, everything with a grain of salt. I think you and I have very aligned viewpoints on most things. And one of them is just balance. So don't get too crazy. But I mean, I've had on my podcast, the father of the locations effect movement. It's this group of people that swear by their sensitivity to different locations and have healed themselves from different chronic conditions just by going into pristine parts of the world where they feel like they can get free from sort of this location derived burden. And just to close out on this, I do think that people that have lower levels of diamine oxidase and have these allergies and these types of issues, the histamine issues, are people that are more likely to have sensitivity to location and are people that are more likely to have health and wellness outcomes differ by where they're physically sitting.
That's really interesting. That's what I thought you were talking about, but I was like, I feel like I need to ask him because I don't know if I'm understanding what he's saying. So yeah, it's just crazy. It's like sometimes I live in North Carolina, which is kind of like in between. It's not exactly pristine, but it's certainly not, like New York or LA or something with like pollution and that kind of stuff. And I don't know. I feel like, and I don't want to go down a crazy rabbit hole or I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but even with the whole COVID hotspots, it's like you wonder these areas where we live where like North Carolina has not been very strongly affected. Yes, we've had issues, but not anywhere near the way that some of the other states have. And it's interesting how everyone's like, oh, it's based on like their political climate or whatever. And it kind of makes me wonder, I'm like, could it maybe be related to how polluted their air is usually? And maybe that's why people are getting sicker. So I definitely don't want to, because that could be definitely its own podcast. And also I am not an expert on that. So I'm not going to go down that track, but it is really interesting to think, just how the country right now is so like everybody has such different ideas of what the country needs. And it's very interesting to think about the fact that like your physical environment could actually be strongly impacting the way that you interpret some of the political stuff going on with like the environment or like, I don't know, just like racism, all the different things that people are either more or less concerned about. And it does seem to really vary based on location.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, location definitely is one piece in the puzzle. I mean, the way I like to look at these things is, everything's a soup. It's like, how is location the broth for you? Is it a touch of cilantro? I don't know, but I think it's definitely an ingredient in that mix, in certain situations.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to check out your podcast on that because I always love learning about stuff that's like totally random like that. So like, I want to hear about it. So anyway, so what I was going to ask before, just to kind of bring it back to, the reason why I guess not the reason I brought you on this podcast, but one of the main things I wanted to talk to you about is the concept of having information from a report like this and then really comparing it to your personal experience or maybe, what you've learned over the course of years of experimentation. Because when I was looking at my report, I think a lot of stuff definitely made sense. Like, the high glycemic index foods, I definitely don't do great if my blood sugar is weird or if I'm having a lot of sugar itself, I definitely get like negative response to. So I don't think I tolerate lots of sugar, and I feel like the report definitely supported that. And, the whole caffeine thing, for sure, I am sensitive to caffeine and it doesn't work well for me. But then there was some other stuff on the report that I was like, this doesn't really line up with my personal experience. So the example that I shared when I sent John some information ahead of the interview, just to kind of let him know what I was going to talk to him about, I did mention as an example, the sodium guidelines from the report suggest that I reduce my sodium intake and closely monitor my levels and pay attention to blood pressure. And it's interesting because from an experience perspective, I've always actually dealt with low blood pressure, and I've needed to actually specifically try to get more salt or like consistently salt my food to make sure that I am keeping my blood pressure stable, because I'm prone to like dizzy spells or, that tunnel vision kind of thing if my blood pressure gets too low. So, and that's one example. I think the other two examples that come to mind, one would be, I will preface this by saying I'm not criticizing the report or like the information that's shared, because I do think it's, like I said, really valuable and interesting. But as an example, the protein guidelines were suggesting that I get the bulk of my protein from plants. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And then the other piece was the vitamin A recommendations, saying that I'm good at getting vitamin A from food. So, that plants could possibly be adequate. So I'm just using these as a couple examples. So again, I feel physically better when I eat enough salt and I purposefully salt my food. I have had symptoms of vitamin A deficiency if I'm not being very mindful of either supplementing or eating things like liver, cod liver oil. And then with protein, anytime I've ever done more of like a plant-based protein type of eating strategy, like for example, I experimented. I did a Daniel fast with my church like last year or 2 years ago, and I felt terrible. And that was me like really trying to crush the plant-based protein to get it all in to not feel terrible. I'm just curious, like when somebody gets a report like this and they have personal experience that conflicts with the guidelines, what's your perspective on like what should I do, or how should I use that information to influence the decisions I might make around my diet when some of them might be in conflict with personal experience?
Yeah, well, so Scott, there's a lot to unpack there. So
sorry about that.
That's okay. So I mean, I think put simply, we're trying to empower people to eat in a way that makes them healthy, and so we're not trying to advance dogma or anything like that. I would say that what you started out with, the first thing I'd want to know about your background is I'd want to know some biomarkers. So I'd want to know, I'd want to try to get a sense of whether you've ever had elevated small dense LDL, whether you've ever had elevated VLDL, whether your trigs have ever gone kind of high. And I'd love to know like what your overall particle count, like your ApoB number, a lot of these heart health metrics look like, because as I said at the beginning of the show, what the algorithm is first and foremost designed to do is to capture for people a good, solid cardiometabolic footprint, which is really lacking from our diet conversations right now. I talk to people who call me and who are on the carnivore diet, and their particle count, their LDL particle count, which is just the total number of LDL particles that are kind of all total number of taxis that are on the road. And LDL is not by itself, it's necessary, but not sufficient to cause heart disease. I mean, you have to have these lipoproteins trafficking in fats. It's what crashes the artery wall. It's what causes heart disease. So we want to try to keep people in balance there. I'll talk to people that are on the carnivore diet. Their particle count is so high, it can't be measured. I've literally talked to people that have like a 3,600 break the chart count. So again, the first thing the algorithm is trying to do, it sounds like it categorized you pretty well. In terms of the vitamin A, that's looking at beta carotene metabolism. We probably could do a better job of updating that headline in the report so that it's clear that we're looking at the body's ability to use plant sources to convert beta carotene into vitamin A, because you have retinol, which is the bioavailable form of vitamin A that you get when you eat meat. And then you have the body takes beta carotene and it converts it into vitamin A. And so we're looking at that enzymatic process that literally some people, especially it's important for people that are going more plant-based, if they can't convert beta carotene into vitamin A, it's a problem, right? So we're looking at that. And then you say the sodium issue. Did you upload an ancestry file or like a 23andMe file?
23andMe.
Yeah. So with 23andMe, we're kind of at the mercy a little bit more of the SNPs that 23andMe chooses to report on from version to version. We can still do great scoring and we can still give people like a really good assigned diet. But when you get into more of these ancillary issues like sodium, some of those markers are not always reported as thoroughly from version to version in 23andMe as they would be in our test kit that you can order from our website. If you're looking at like low blood pressure and not feeling well when you don't get animal protein in the algorithm, it does look like it does call for you to be a little more mindful of getting iron in your diet. And some of the symptoms that you mentioned can tie back to a deficiency in iron as well. This is not about dogma. This is not about telling people that they have to be on like the exact diet that we assign to them. It's really meant as just a tool, as one tool to try to have a regimen that's personalized to what's going to work for them. I mean, I can tell you straight out that, going on a totally plant-based diet with a lot of like sandwiches for lunch with gluten-free bread and just eating a lot of pasta and stuff like that, we would predict would be a real disaster for you. And at the same time, we would also predict that if you started going really high fat, that you'd see your lipids get to a place that you wouldn't like either. So hopefully that answers your question. And also just for the listeners, the forager diet, it does emphasize plant proteins, but it's definitely not exclusively a plant-based diet.
Yeah. I think it said like 55% or something. I don't know, some 55% plant, which, and for me, it's not that I think like plant-based proteins are bad. I just know whenever I've gone heavily in the plant-based protein direction, it just doesn't seem to work with my blood sugar very well. And I didn't know, I wasn't sure which specific markers were suggesting to emphasize plants. So and again, like we said, genetics are a piece of the puzzle. It's not something that is like, you need to eat for these genetics, or if you don't, you're going to, die of a heart attack in your 30s or something like that. And I feel like this information can be really valuable as just information, right? Like, it's like, okay, well, now that I know that I have some genes that would suggest this, maybe I don't want to do bulletproof coffee in the morning with caffeine and butter and coconut oil and all this stuff, which I definitely dabbled in that like 10 years ago or something, and for sure did not make me feel my best. So, learn that lesson pretty quick, but just to have those genes to, confirm that, I think is valuable. And then some of this other stuff like, the plant-based versus animal-based proteins. At the end of the day, my feeling is that an individual's experience is the most important thing. So both how you feel, and then obviously, like you were saying, actual lab markers, that's going to be the most important thing to be monitoring. And I feel like the genetic information gives you a place to experiment from, rather than it being like the end all be all of like, this is the way you need to eat and don't question it.
Yeah. The problem is that it goes back, just to come full circle to what we were talking about at the beginning of the call, is like, it's not just that the doctors don't have time, it's that they don't have the knowledge, right? They don't yet have the knowledge. And so like, on some of these frontiers. And I look at my family members, people that go get blood tests, like the blood tests that 99% of people get are not the Cadillac. They're not like the most informative blood test that they can get about what the actual state of their health is. And so one of the things that's really useful about some of these genetic markers is it's an easy way to see which biomarkers you might want to pay attention to and you might want to look at, because it's going to give you your predispositions for example, cholesterol hyperabsorption, elevated sitosterol. We have Lp(a) in here, which is like one of the biggest risk factors for heart disease that nobody knows about. And you can see whether it's a genetically determined type of quote bad cholesterol, which you can see whether you have. I'm looking at your charts. You don't appear to have either of the SNPs, which is great news. But somebody looks at this chart, nobody's getting their lipoprotein A tested. We're not at the tip of the spear for the biomarkers. The beautiful part about some of these genetic markers is you could be like, oh, okay. I have a SNP in this LPA region. I know I need to go get my lipoprotein A tested when before it wasn't even on my radar. Or, okay, I see that I might be a hyperabsorber of cholesterol. I need to go and get tested because I might have undiagnosed cytosterolemia. Or, okay, I have ApoE4. I'm going to have this really crazy reaction to saturated fat when I eat the steak or whatever, the butter. And so, yeah, it all works in concert. I totally agree. But there's a lot you can do with your genetic markers for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And like I said, I don't want to come across as if I'm criticizing it. It's just more, I like to always bring the nuance to the conversation to make sure that if people are going out and getting these reports, which I think are great and definitely very informative and interesting, and like you said, a great place to take action from, that they're also kind of having that little voice in the back of their head. Maybe it's my voice, a little angel on the shoulder or something, just saying like, okay, just remember that like if you feel a certain way when you eat, that's as important, if not possibly more important than saying like, well, my genes say I should feel this way, or my genes say this is the way I should eat. So I feel like we need to always kind of look at multiple angles. And a lot of times I think, and I don't think you're doing this, but I do find that in some of the more, disease focused communities, a lot of times they're so focused on avoiding a particular health condition or, long-term disease state that they end up creating negative health issues or poor quality of life, like now, right? Like, it's like, oh, well, we're trying to reduce the risk of heart disease, so we're going to do all these things to reduce that. And then you end up creating like hypothyroidism or, amenorrhea or something like that, that is really not healthy for the person now. And so I always like to just make sure, hey, if you feel good the way you're eating and your labs look good, even if it's not 100% aligned with a gene report, that's fine. If you don't feel your best while eating, or you do have problematic labs, then I feel like the genetic information can be a great place to experiment from.
Yeah. I mean, I think everybody in this space wants to be the shaman, right? They all want to be kind of like the final shaman, and that's fine, and at the end of the day, if you're listening at home, you just got to pick your shaman, and I think that's pretty much what it boils down to.
Well, I would rather not be anybody's shaman, so maybe I'm weird like that. But I feel like I believe people can, really know what's best for themselves, and to collect information and to get feedback from different people, but also to trust their own judgment about things if they feel a certain way. So, but like I said, I think the gene information is super interesting, and maybe I'll need to order the actual test that you guys sell, because I think I got my 23andMe report done like 10 years ago at this point, and I know the technology has changed, so it might be time for me to update a little bit of the actual information itself.
Yeah, I mean, the 23andMe report still gives you great coverage, though. I mean, you're still getting the vast majority of the markers that we report on. It's a good guide, and at the end of the day, I mean, yeah, you gotta look. If there's two things I would just emphasize for anybody at home listening, is the genetics is one piece of the puzzle. It's not the whole piece of the puzzle. When you get into the biomarkers, make sure you're honoring the spirit of the biomarkers. People that tell you that, cholesterol is, high cholesterol is not causal in heart disease. It's not something that you need to worry about. They're not right.
They're not accurate.
Well, yeah, by and large, look, it doesn't mean you need to have your cholesterol at zero, and nobody wants that. But, people that are like, there's pretty good evidence that like we have pretty good science on these issues. And then at the end of the day, you gotta figure out what works for you. And, I think your point is really well taken. I mean, we can get into these tyrannies of nutrition influencers where people are just being browbeaten with these different protocols and they're not enjoying their food. They're terrified of their food, and that's no fun. You got to eat, you got to have fun, you got to enjoy your life, So your genes are not necessarily your destiny, but man, if I had 2 copies of ApoE4, I would certainly want to know it, and a lot of other ones as well. And there's a lot of other ones as well. So yeah, it's just, we're coming over here from this little genetics part of the world. This is it's like you landed on, the genetics planet, and that's where we're coming at it from. And, I'd like to update the product with some microbiome stuff in the future. And we're always trying to add new genetic markers. So yeah, of course people are individuals, and everybody needs to figure out for themselves what works for them. I couldn't agree. I totally agree. Totally agree.
And not to contradict myself, but to play my own devil's advocate, a lot of the stuff that you guys are looking at, as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, does take time to develop into a disease state. So, you do want to balance feeling good today with protecting your health in the future. So sometimes things that maybe don't cause a problem now could cause a problem in the future. So I think it is good to know this stuff, and it is good to be aware without becoming like orthorexic about it. So all of that said, I'm sure we're going to have people that are interested in getting more information and finding out what their diet type is and learning about what their genes say. So where can people go to learn more and to get their genetic information analyzed?
So we are at mygenefood.com. You can check us out at mygenefood.com. And we have a podcast, the Gene Food Podcast. You can search, it's on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all those places. We have Facebook and social media. Just search the internet for Gene Food. You should be able to find us. We're there for you.
Cool. Well, we'll link to mygenefood.com. So that way, if people want to get their report done, like I said, super interesting and definitely something worth digging into a little bit if you're wanting to optimize your health. Well, anyway, thank you so much for your time, John. It was really great to chat with you, and thanks for taking the hardball questions that maybe they weren't super hardball, but I do appreciate you being willing to see the nuance where I feel like a lot of times people are very, very dogmatic about their own opinions. So I love that we're on the same page with that.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me on, and I really appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks to all of you for hanging out with us for the last hour. I hope you learned something interesting or important to your health today, and we'll see you here next week on the Fed and Fearless podcast. Take care, everybody. Hey, everyone. Laura Schoenfeld here again. As you know, I absolutely love working with women from all walks of life to help them create a purpose-filled life that they love. And over the past 2 years, I've expanded my mission to help nutrition business owners drop the hustle and come into alignment with their ideal business goals so they can work from a sense of ease and abundance and grow their income and their impact with joy. Unlike other business coaches, I have experience in the integrative and functional medicine, health, and wellness industry. And I've heavily invested in my own online business training and mentorship to get to a place where I'm now bringing in multiple 6 figures of revenue on an annual basis. Would you believe that I've invested over $130,000 in my own business development and mentorship over the past 7+ years? And honestly, that's just the financial cost of growing my business. It's taken me hours and hours of testing, learning, experimenting, and lots of failing to get to the place where I am today. After all this, I can tell you one thing with absolute certainty. There's no way I would be where I am today if I had not been willing to invest in my growth and to find the incredible mentors who have helped me accelerate my business faster than I ever imagined. The truth is that running an online business can be incredibly isolating. And if you don't have the right strategy or systems in place, it can take up nearly every waking minute of your free time, which is a recipe for a major health disaster and some serious business burnout. To grow your business to 6 figures and beyond without destroying your physical and mental health, you need support from both a mentor and a community of people who know what it's like to run a nutrition business online, who can help you succeed faster and easier than you'd be able to on your own. And that's why I'm so excited to offer a space for you to experience joyful and profitable business growth while being surrounded and supported by other driven nutritionists on the same thrilling journey of entrepreneurship. This opportunity is my annual mastermind. In the mastermind, you'll create relationships that will last a lifetime and achieve results in your business that you never would have imagined for yourself. If you want to learn more about this mastermind opportunity, go to lauraschoenfeld.com/mastermind. On that page, you'll find everything you need to know about what the mastermind includes and how to apply for your spot. I'd love to connect with you further about the business that you're growing and how the mastermind can help you support your goals. So go to lauraschoenfeld.com/mastermind to send in your application, and I look forward to chatting with you soon.